hulking Space Marine chaplain stared down at his skull helm. Memento mori. The skull was carved in great detail, a perfect mirror of reality. Its glass eyes caught the red lights illuminating the inside of the transport as it rattled and shook. The ship cut through the atmosphere in choppy starts, but the chaplain's legs shifted easily with each lurch. His brow was furrowed, and in the trapped heat of the ship, sweat slid down his charcoal black face. His own red eyes met the unblinking glare of the skull. Neither shifted in their battle. The Marines around him were busy checking each other's power armor for faults. With rough taps, they verified integrity and ensured proper fit. They turned their weapons over in their hands, looking for minute faults that might cause a malfunction. With hushed voices, they counted ammunition and grenades. The simplest actions stilled the mind, focused intention. Their goals were clear. Find the tech priest, discover what he knows, stop the enemy. The chaplain had added his own objective: save as many as possible. He spun the helmet in his hands and sank it down onto his head. The seals hissed as the helmet locked into place. The beacon they were chasing had been intercepted just a week ago. The chaplain had made all haste here at the order of Adrax Agatone, his captain. Because of a multitude of rising problems in the Imperium of Man, only a small portion of the chapter was assigned to his command. Fine Marines all, but so few. Seemingly an insignificant number once the system had been assessed. The pilot's voice came through his helmet speakers.
The city's anti-air guns are filling the sky with shrapnel. It will be a challenge to navigate. Expect a rough approach. Touchdown in 15 minutes.
The ship caught an air pocket in the dust storm surrounding it and rattled hard. The chaplain ran through the details in his mind again. There are demonic incursions present on this planet with expected Khorne corruption throughout the populace. A seemingly random splinter group from the Tyranid Hive fleet Kraken encroaches on the outer edges of the system. My intelligence operations inform me that they are moving rapidly on a course to meet our own forces in days. There have also been anomalous readings gathered from surveys of the various planetary bodies. They suggest that the planets are shifting their own orbits, ignoring physical law. Then, there is my quarter of a company from a broken legion. What is this beacon? What power must be present here to attract all the horrors of the galaxy to a seemingly insignificant system? An apothecary in front of the chaplain turned to meet the glaring red eyes of the skull helm. He began his assessment of the chaplain's war gear, banging on battered pieces of the armor. He slapped an old scrape on the side of the chaplain's helm hard enough to knock his commander from his sour thoughts. Then, he spoke via a private Vox channel between the two.
A scratch from High Fleet Leviathan where they thought their claws were harder than your head.
The apothecary jutted a finger into a deep, painted-over crater below the chaplain's breastbone.
A nick from a heretic's round who found your faith impenetrable.
The apothecary's mechanical arm snaked behind the chaplain and harshly poked at a slice in the armor so clean that it looked to have been made by a scalpel cutting into soft flesh, not ceramite.
And a slice from a demon's blade who might have had you if I wasn't there.
The apothecary grabbed each side of the chaplain and shook him.
I'm Chaplain Isilkane, known to his men as the Shepherd of Fire, second only to Captain Agatone of the 3rd Company of Salamanders, and true son of Vulcan. I know I do not sense fear from you. I know what I see is not doubt in our cause. Tell me honestly.
Kane looked down at his battle brother of more than 2 centuries and spoke. His voice came across the Vox with a quiet strength.
Never fear, Zadai. Fear denies faith.
Apothecary Zadai stared a moment, then spoke as his arms came to rest across his chest.
Then what, Kane?
If this fails, I know I acted in haste, but the situation demanded it. I know this. Yet the impossible weight of what might be sits balanced on a blade's edge just above my head. The enemy must be stopped here, now. But if we are not enough, then the city, perhaps even the planet, perishes with us.
Zadai shook his helmeted head and turned away, towards the front of the gunship, still speaking on the private channel.
When have we faced an enemy on equal footing, Isel? Would Vulcan brood as you do? Would our father think his life was better given elsewhere?
A short gut laugh came from Kane.
I suppose not. What we do is good and righteous. Those we seek to save cannot save themselves.
Zadai nodded and gave reassurance.
Every man here would happily give his life 1,000 times over for the Imperium and its people. We are where we should be, and we will do what we must.
Zadai faced back to the front of the ship, pausing for a moment before he spoke over his shoulder.
Have a little faith, Chaplain.
Kane could hear the sly smile in his friend's voice. Overpowering their speakers, the pilot's broadcast came again.
Prepare for increased turbulence. AA fire is heavy.
Kane smiled at his friend's mocking tone.
I would hope I might have more than a little.
A terrible sound came from his left. An explosion, then the grinding, screeching noise of metal tearing free. The aircraft lurched, sending a score of unprepared Marines into the ceiling. Their clanking armor joined the madness of motion and sound. Red lights flashed and alarms blared as the cabin filled with sudden rushes of air, smoke, and dust. The descent shifted their stomachs as the feeling of plummeting filled each soldier. No screams came from the assembled. No prayers were sent up. All were resolute. The gunship streaked down towards the sands below. Its left wing trembled and shook, hanging on by torn threads. With the wing non-functional, it tried to spiral out of control, but the pilot made every effort to right the ship. But the outcome was inevitable. The ship's belly came into contact with the desert's surface first. Thrusters at the front of the ship that typically assisted in zero-gravity maneuvering were activated. The jets of fire were just enough to tilt the front of the ship up, preventing it from plowing into the sand at a breakneck pace. It plowed on, carving a trench across the desert's surface, leaving puddles of oil and fire in its wake. Finally, it began to slow, and with a creaking tilt, the massive metal came to a stop. The wreckage was surrounded by dunes and jutting rock pillars reaching up towards the sky. Before it was at a full rest, High Chaplain Kane could be heard inside bellowing out orders. At his command, those that could still move left the ship. Some aided their brothers, supporting them arm in arm as they brought the wounded before Apothecary Zadai. He worked with haste and extreme precision. Kneeling at each Marine, he administered aid and suppressants. His mechanical arm assisted with each procedure. It whirred loudly as it matched the apothecary's speed. Kane's voice rang out as he motioned harshly at a Marine in Centurion armor with chevrons on his shoulder.
Sergeant Adar!
The Marine moved quickly towards the chaplain, even with his bulky armor. His footfalls were heavy, leaving deep imprints on the desert sand. In spite of the fact Adar towered over Isel Kane, he bowed his head reverently before his commander of 5 decades and saluted fist to chest. Adar was more than frightening. His war gear was designed for maximum destruction. Attached to his arms were siege drills made to breach the thickest plate. Flamers were mounted to his wrists and were capable of burning through flesh with ease. Beside all this were hurricane bolters able to fire enough ammunition within a second to live up to their namesake. He was a walking tank. Those who had the honor of donning the Centurion's armor could stand alone against a horde and emerge victorious.
You will be the anchor to our defense here. I have no doubt the enemy approaches our position. We will need to form a ring around Apothecary Zadai so he can continue his work. Once we have repelled the enemy, and the injured are able to move, we will rendezvous with our other forces. This should have secured the Tech Priest bunker by the time we arrive. I suspect they will be coming from the south, so position your men there.
Adar nodded and moved to give his own orders. The 2 other Centurions that made up his squad lumbered into position with their weapons ready. Kane gave direction to every squad sergeant, and soon the survivors of the wreck stood in a circular formation around Zadai. Within a few minutes, the injured that Zadai had worked on were on their feet, filled with stimulants and pain suppressants. Kane placed them at the back of the formation, where they would hopefully encounter fewer enemies. He gave the order to move, and his small band of soldiers began to march slowly. Their heads pivoted about, searching for targets on the horizon. Before the enemy became visible, their yells could be heard above the howls of the desert wind. The screeches were unhinged and forced out of shredded vocal cords that only knew how to scream. The few battle cries they chanted were formed in dim minds that sought only the bloodlust of battle.
Centurions, make ready. Fire at half range. Remind them of what happens to the faithless.
The centurions walked backwards, slowly, ready for the onslaught. The first over the dunes were red-eyed humans sporting a random mix of weapons: axes, swords, pieces of rebar, clubs filled with nails. Into their skin they had cut heretical symbols that oozed blood down exposed chest. These were weak minds bent to the will of a false god offering promises of eternity. They deserved no mercy. The centurions' hurricane bolters were unleashed as ordered. The high-caliber rounds tore through the surging horde. Torsos were shredded, and heads were reduced to red mist. Those that died this way were lucky. The remaining few were bathed in promethium that evaporated skin and turned bone to char. Kane nodded appreciatively to the sergeant as Adar's men did their cleansing work. His head swiveled, scanning the horizon. He tuned out the cries of the dying and the harsh booms of bolter fire as another wave of cultists were brought to heel. Heat signatures registered in Kane's helmet's heads-up display. Something was approaching from the north, a flanking maneuver. The madmen seemed to have some small tactical knowledge. Kane gave an order his battle-hardened soldiers had anticipated. They too had seen the new threat.
Rear ranks, at the ready.
Kane was expecting more cultists, maybe even a demon, but what he saw turned his calm, tactical mind to rage. Heretic Astartes sprinted across the sand, cresting over the dunes. Space Marines who had forsaken their emperor and given their souls over to chaos. They raised chain axes above their head, revving them angrily as they bore down on the Salamander's formation. Their once holy armor had been tainted with the harsh angular symbols of Khorne. Kane knew them for what they were: world eaters, worshippers of Khorne. They slaughtered the innocent wherever their cursed boots trod. Where peace was, they sought to tear it apart. Each and every one of them was a rabid dog that must be put down. They should have been his brothers, but now they were forever his enemy. Kane could only see an Imperium that could have been if had not been for these heretics. These traitors. Centuries of hate and pain filled him. With reckless abandon, the heretics made their charge. Those without helmets were wild-eyed, their armors adorned with heads and skulls. The grisly trophies were affixed like medals to their chests, or impaled on spikes jutting out from their blood-red armor for all to see. They foamed at the mouth as they cried out. Most of it was unintelligible madness, but in the cacophony, one chant was repeated without end. Melta streams connected with the heretics, sending a handful of them up in righteous flame. Despite their injuries, the Marines stood ready. The Salamanders met the madness with unwavering resolve. They calmly picked their targets as more promethium and bolter fire reduced the charging heretics to half their original strength. It was not enough. The heretics would still reach them before they could be gunned down. Kane moved to stand in front of his men.
Officers, forward!
The air crackled with electricity as each squad's sergeant prepared thunderhammers for combat. Lightning arced from the weapons as they thrummed with power. The two sides clashed. World Eater traitors cut down Salamander loyalists. The Salamander's formation came to a halt by the sheer weight of the impact. The heretics looked for the easiest targets. Those whose legs were already mangled from the wreck found themselves knocked to the ground, and soon, with wicked chain axes, the heretics cut into them. Red splattered across green. As blood began to coat the sand and Marines alike, the traitors' bloodlust was driven to new heights. They howled in glee and cut quicker, deeper. The Salamanders fought back valiantly, sending their enemies flying backwards as thunderhammers hit their targets. Other Marines drew bolter pistols and fired point-blank into the World Eaters. They chose their targets well. The bolts flew into exposed or weak portions of the heretics' armor. Fortunately, the traitors were simply more skilled in close-quarters fighting. Every fiber of their being was dedicated to killing. But against one Marine, no heretic could stand. The Shepherd of Fire began to purge. Kane had made contact with the closest traitor. The impact from his mace threw the heretic to the ground. The chaos-twisted Marine snarled up at Kane. This one wore no helmet. This close, Kane could see in intimate detail the black wires like snakes that rose from the traitor's red armor and dug into his skull. Red, angry flesh rose to meet the wires. The two were forever fused together. Into that traitorous face, Isel Kane brought down his mace. Blood splattered across the sand. Hate burned within him. A trophy on the next Marine that Kane rushed towards was from a child no older than 12. His entire body shook. Kane matched their rage with his own. The heretic Marine's helmet was shattered as the mace made contact. His crazed voice rang out, no longer muffled by the helmet. As he lashed out frantically, his chain axe connected with Kane's side for a moment, but the blow had no time to tear at the chaplain's armor. Kane's mace turned the traitor's head to red paste. The shepherd gave their hate back tenfold. The third Marine he sought to fell threw up his chain axe defensively. He began a chant hoping for Khorne's favor. Faith in their false god would be proven weak. High Chaplain Kane rammed his knee into the World Eater's gut. The Marine doubled over, gasping for air. In Kane's eyes, he bowed, surrendering. Another head was removed from its host. Where Isel Kane was, no beast of a false god could stand. The heretics were drawn to the bloodbath Kane caused. They lived to fight. It was all they knew. Killing was all they craved. The remaining traitors moved to swarm him, hungering for a challenge. He bellowed,
"Fall back!"
His men parted, trusting his orders. He stood alone against the remaining World Eaters. His stance became defensive as he swatted away strikes. One of the axes he struck bent, but the Marine was undeterred and threw himself at the chaplain, kicking and punching. With a mighty heave, Kane tossed the heretic backwards. This created a small distance between the traitors and himself. Over the Vox, Kane commanded his troops, trusting their aim.
"Fire!"
Promethium splashed onto red armor and melted thick ceramite before it poured onto the flesh beneath. The smell of the blaze was vile. The crazed Marines died snarling in defiance. Kane clung to his hallowed mace, turning it over in his hands as blood dripped from its many spikes. He assessed the battlefield again, his rage suppressed for now, so that his mind could be clear. Marines moved to carry those wounded in the charge to Apothecary Zadai. He mended the worst of them, but some lie painfully still. Their gene seed would have been extracted, ensuring the Salamanders as a chapter would persist. The traitors' want for close-quarters killing had led to their death at range. The false god Khorne compelled them into melee combat no matter the cost to themselves. Pools of blood had formed on the sand under the massacred bodies of cultists and Astartes alike. Where Promethium had fallen, bodies were charred, and the desert's surface had turned to glass. The last of the enemy came now, lashing out in a final assault. They were undeterred by the loss of their fellows. Good tactics dictated that one should accept losses and conserve resources for another day, but retreat had never been an option for the World Eaters. 3 large twitching and glowing Marines sprinted towards the Centurions, while a terrible monstrosity lurched towards Kane and the injured in the rear. Something was different about the charging Marines. They stood multiple feet taller than what was expected, nearly rivaling the Centurions in height. Their armor clung to a body so large that limbs and flesh were unable to be contained by metal plates. Their skin was a hellish red, illuminated by glowing veins that flashed with every heartbeat. Out of their skin sprouted spikes at odd angles. Limbs were no longer bound by metal, but instead jutted out of their armor with long claws where nails should be. They raised weapons that looked able to slice through a limb with ease. They seemed to be altered mentally as well. Their minds and intentions seemed to be torn. Their heads snatched madly in every direction. Their glowing yellow eyes flared in intensity with each shift. Their focus seemed to be in constant flux as they snarled and screamed, rushing forward. However, this did nothing to stop them from their pursuit of one thing: slaughter. The Centurion's response was immediate. As soon as the possessed were within range, white-hot promethium consumed 2 of the huge heretical marines. The third one sprinted forward, heedless of his dead allies. He crashed directly into Sergeant Adar. The Centurion's fist clashed with the marine's eviscerator in great fits of sparks. The demonic weapon withstood the drill, where any mundane metal would have been crumpled to uselessness. The possessed marine's blade swung in lightning-fast, expert arcs at Sergeant Adar. He moved to stop or parry the blows, but the heretic's head twitched, his eyes flashing yellow as they stared seemingly unseeing up into the sky as the blade pivoted mid-swing with impossible speed. The Centurion barely managed to bat aside the swing, but in less than a second the heretic had his blade to bear again. This time he cut at Adar's gauntlet. The drill stopped spinning. The heretic moved again, so fast that Adar's eyes could not track him. The marine blurred and was suddenly hacking at Adar's other side. His head twitched, his veins engorged and grew red as his heart beat. With a single wrenching swipe, the sergeant's hand fell to the sand. A grunt came from the Centurion. Adar moved to punch the marine with a now still drill, but compared to his opponent's speed, it was as if he was moving through tar. The heretic's head twitched, and his glowing yellow eyes finally focused, meeting Adar's red eyes. A mad smile ripped across the World Eater's face. The possessed marine brought his demonic blade frantically down into Adar's head. He worked feverishly to bisect the ancient warrior. The noise of ripping metal and flesh being torn away in great hunks was sickening. The duel had lasted no more than a few seconds. He had made it to Adar's navel before the remaining Centurions sandwiched the beast between their siege drills. They spun opposite of each other, shredding the shrieking heretic into sticky red bits. Viscera from the World Eater coated the ground, still pulsing red for a few seconds longer, as if the heretic's body reveled in its own slaughter. In the rear, the spawn of chaos approached. It was a miserable-looking creature. It charged the loyalist Astartes, using a mass of limbs and tentacles to propel itself. A plethora of mouths were scattered across the thing with no regard to order. It slobbered in anticipation. Its drool frothed white as it ran over scores of teeth jammed incredibly close together. Bolter rounds connected with it. Even Zadai stopped tending to the wounded and fired his own absolver pistol at the thing. The oversized bolter rounds ripped hunks of meat from the monster, but its flesh simply reformed. Its unholy constitution disgusted Cain. The chaplain readied his mace and sprinted at the monster, building a ferocious speed that only an Astartes could manage. This abomination would not take any of his men's lives while he still stood. He would stop it before it reached the injured. "If it desires a challenge, I will bring unto it the Emperor's wrath." Across each soldier's Vox channel, Cain's voice boomed in exhortation of rage.
Sons of Vulcan, sons of war, sons of fire, let hatred burn, and from an anger forge a raging choir!
His shoulder rammed into the Emperor-forsaken creature. It stumbled backward for a moment. Its mouth screeched at having its easy prey ripped from it. It lurched and contacted Cain's shoulder. A mouth chewed and scratched, cutting at his pauldron to no effect. He continued his recitation.
Let the hammer fall!
His mace struck at once, twice, 3 times. Each blow sunk deeper and deeper. The mace's spikes tore ribbons of stringy flesh from the monster.
Answer the call!
A Centurion's siege drill joined beside his mace, ripping into the creature, burrowing a hole through a mad collage of eyes surrounding a snapping mouth.
Show them the endless war we wage!
Thunder hammers connected, throwing up sand. Their concussive blast and electric zapping punctuated Cain's words.
And never let them forget your rage!
The chaplain's mace slammed into the monster a final time. Quivering pieces were strewn about the sands. The writhing bit slunk towards its separate parts, as even now it tried to reconnect with itself.
Burn it!
White flames consumed the abomination. Cain looked about, breathing heavily. His men fared better than they should have against such a determined foe. Zadai had gone back to his bloody work, sealing a wound in a marine's side that was squirting blood. Thanks to the apothecary, and their own discipline, the majority were still upright and ready for their next task. By the Emperor's will, what must be done shall be done. Several minutes passed as Zadai continued. Kane would not interrupt his work just yet. He could not spare much time, but he had faith his friend could work miracles. Today seemed to be a blessed one. Many Kane had assumed dead were on their feet. He moved towards Zadai and aided one of his injured brothers. The Marine offered him a breathy thanks as the chaplain allowed him to lean against himself while they walked. Kane spared a final glance for Adar's ruined body. He called to Zadai, who was also helping along an injured comrade. His voice was steady, hollow.
You were unable to recover his gene seed?
The apothecary nodded his head, confirming Kane's assumption. Adar's body was not the only one they had left bloody and broken in the sand. Their mission demanded all haste possible, no matter the sacrifices made. Kane quieted his troubled thoughts and set his mind to the task at hand. There would be more loss before the Placidus system was done with him and his men.
Move a quick step, Third Company. There is a city to save.
And a tech priest to shake answers from. A battered column of salamanders moved forward as the bloody red sun slipped below the horizon.